I'm so glad to be first in the forefront of talking about the NAR settlement. Those of you just listening, not watching, I've got sarcastic face on right now.
The discussion you just presented to us, you said that buyers and sellers can keep in or take out the commission within the sale price.
But it might reduce the amount of the sale price by that compensation amount. The problem is how is the appraiser going to know what that amount was? And the only thing that I can tell you is that I think that it's part of the part 1.4, right, of USPAP, where it says collect, verify, and analyze all information in order to produce a credible result. So that's where I think we're headed. We're just going to have to do our job better as appraisers.
In August 2024, a new set of rules took effect dictating how realtors are compensated, who pays them, and ultimately changing how Americans buy and sell real estate. It's part of a $418 million settlement into antitrust claims agreed upon by the National Association of Realtors. As many of you know, NAR is a powerful trade organization with 1.5 million members.
So Warren, what exactly are the changes? Historically, sellers paid commission fees for both the buyers and sellers' real estate agents, with commissions totaling between 5 to 6% on the selling price. Under the new rule, sellers' agents will no longer be allowed to advertise commission fees to buyers' agents, a rule meant to prevent a buyer's agent from steering their client away from homes offering below-market commission rates. The other major change is that before touring homes with an agent, buyers must sign a legally binding representation agreement with their agents that details how and what their agents will be paid. The impact of the NAR settlement, the big elephant of the room, is the focus of today's episode of Face Value from the Appraisal Institute. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tonia Vailas.
And I'm Warren Boizot. And Tonia, it's really great that we're the first at Face Value to come with this information. There have been no other publications, videos, articles, anything about this. So I'm so glad to be first in the forefront of talking about the NAR settlement. For those of you just listening, not watching, I've got sarcastic face on right now. So, but there is no doubt Tonia and I have our own opinions and ideas about how the NAR settlement will shape the real estate industry and our own work as real estate appraisers. We're happy to be joined by two very special guests that are here to dig deep with us on this issue. First up, Darwin Ernst, SRA, AI-RRS, is a certified residential appraiser in 3 states and a seasoned real estate practitioner, including instructing. He is the current vice chair of Region 1 for the Appraisal Institute and has served as past president in the Montana chapter. Among other accomplishments, he is most proud of his work helping to design the cadastral mapping for the state of Montana, ensuring that the public had access to the data once completed. Welcome, Darwin.
Thank you for having me.
Heather Mull is an MAI SRA designated appraiser and the owner of Placer Realty Advisors, a full-service commercial appraisal and consultant firm. She is also a commercial associate broker with SRMF in Richmond, Virginia, and adjunct professor of real estate at Virginia Commonwealth University. She is the Region 5 chair and member of the National Appraisal Institute Board of Directors. Most relevant to our discussion today, Heather is 2024 NAR Commercial Economic Forum Chair. She has spoken at the national conference and has been on numerous commercial NAR committees. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tonia, can I take 1 second to ask Darwin to give me a 12-second description of cadastral mapping?
Sure. Cadastral mapping is a situation where it's based on the word cadaster, which is to tax according to the size and appropriateness of your lot that you might own or the property that you own in a certain jurisdiction.
9.2 seconds. Perfect. Thank you. So thank you both for joining us today. Being in the real estate world has had such an uproar, caused so much of a stir for not only appraisers, but agents for sure about this NAR settlement. Darwin, maybe if you could just give, although everyone out there has read about it and everything, give us your best quick summary of what happened and why.
All right. So, this goes back to a situation where there's been a lot of people talking about it for many, many, many years, and it finally decided to go to court. There were some people that were willing to take that on. And so it was a situation where many of the large organizations of realtor organizations, I'd say realtor organizations, sorry, were involved in a lawsuit, and those individuals decided to settle. NAR also decided to settle in lieu of, trying to go take this all the way to court. So the idea is that no longer within the MLS are you allowed to, put in a commission amount if you have agreed to, or if your MLS has agreed to abide by the settlement agreement. So once you opt into that settlement agreement, the MLS is no longer able to have that commission or that compensation amount for the potential for a seller to pay a buyer's agent. And so that has to be negotiated separately in the side. I do want to make the point, though, that you can still offer compensation if you're talking about your advertisements online or in the paper or different sources. You just can't do that when you're talking about on the multiple listing service. So you can say that you have a brokerage that wants to work with another brokerage and say that you're going to offer a certain amount of compensation from the seller side to the buyer's agent or the buyer's broker. That's legal. You just can't do it in the MLS.
So it's interesting you say that. You're allowed to advertise the commission that's going to the seller's broker on an advertisement, but not on MLS?
The MLS is the organization, the multiple listing services around the nation. They're the ones that have, technically opted in to this scenario where you're not going to offer that compensation on their site. And so, but realtors can, or real estate agents still can, take out an advertisement in the paper or on the radio or someplace else and say that they're willing to work with the other side and let them know that that's available to them.
Heather, anything else you'd like to add just about the basics of the NAR settlement?
I think that Darwin covered it really well. Obviously on commercial, I know we'll get into this a little more, but it's a little bit different over there. Some of the sites that we use, a lot of the sites that we use in commercial already, we're not advertising the amount of compensation. So I won't say it's business as usual. Few things have changed. We can get to discussing that, but some of the stuff we were already kind of used to dealing with in commercial already. But I think as far as the lawsuit and everything, yeah, Darwin covered it great.
When I talk to friends and family and things like that about people who aren't in the real estate world, my very simple explanation has been a group of buyers decided or didn't realize that compensation or the commission from their agents was able to be negotiated. And that was kind of the crux of the initial lawsuit. Would you say that's pretty spot on? Or
I would say that, yeah, that's pretty spot on. Yeah, you were having where sellers were saying, hey, we didn't know that we could negotiate. And you also had some companies, big companies were accused of that the brokers were telling their agents, you can't negotiate. I'm not saying whether they did or not. I'm just saying that was the basis for it. So they were saying, hey, it was a company policy. So it kind of went over into to hinging on some type of antitrust type laws that were being violated. And that's kind of where everything came from.
I think it was more of the sellers too that were enraged by the fact that they were, constantly being told that they had to sell or that they had to pay for both sides of the, brokerage firms. So I think they were the ones that initiated it.
Are buyers now responsible to pay a percentage of the commission?
It depends upon how they write their agreement, right? What has to happen at this point is that if you have a buyer and you're acting as a real estate agent, you want to have that buyer have an agreement with you that you're representing that buyer, first of all, before you start looking at houses. And they use the word touring, but that's actually going to showings and actively looking for houses. Now, once you have that agreement, you still have to figure out from whichever house that you're going to and whichever brokerage firm represents that particular house, what the compensation agreement might look like. They might be offering, 2, 3, 2.5, 2.25, 2 and 3, whatever compensation to the buyer's agent from the seller's agent, right? Actually, it's the brokerage. I should take that back. It's not the agents, it's the brokerage that are making these decisions. Now, the agents are required to sign that document if they're involved, but the brokerages are the ones that actually have to have the agreement, because that's who is deciding how much commission is going to go to each side. And they're always going to try to refer to that as compensation anymore when you talk to any realtor group or organization, because they feel like that's a better representation of how this works. You might be paid on a hourly basis. You might be paid on a percentage of the sale price. But the buyer's agent has to work that out, not only with his broker, but his or her broker, sorry. They also have to figure out about the selling broker, how much, commission they may be willing to put towards the buyer's compensation. And it may be zero. So at that point, you have to have an agreement with your particular, buyer client that says, hey, if they're not going to pay, would you be willing to pay this amount? And of course, when you think about how that works, that might impact your offer price, right? If the seller's not going to provide that compensation, then the buyer might say, well, let's take that out of the sale price and we're going to offer something less.
So if I'm a buyer and I'm in the market right now looking for a home, do I have to enter into an exclusive agreement with a broker, or do I have to have an agreement with each broker that I engage to look at certain properties?
Yeah, so there's different client relationships, right? And those are exclusive, and you can have a non-exclusive where you can work with different brokers. So you have to have an agreement with everyone that you work with before you start looking at houses.
To piggyback on that question, Darwin, that Tonia just had, each property too, do you have to have an individual agreement on each property? Because let's say I am your buyer, you're my agent, and I want to go look at this house over here in Main Street, Montana, and you're going to show it to me. This particular listing agent is not offering any compensation. So I have to agree with you on how you're going to get paid. But then this house, this one down the street that I also want to see, they are offering compensation. Do I have to have a separate agreement, or can it be over a period of time, or everyone is just going to be this percentage? How does that work?
Well, so you have two separate agreements, right? One is the buyer broker agreement that says that you're representing them and you have a certain amount of potential compensation if that buyer chooses to buy a house that you showed them. So you could literally go down Main Street, Montana, right, and show that one individual that is your client several different houses based upon your relationship with that particular buyer and what they're looking for. So then it becomes an issue. Each and every one of those houses are potential ones that you might want to put an offer in, right? Now you need to know what that compensation amount might be, especially if you're going to write up an agreement to offer, to purchase that property. And that's where we get into, well, was it going to adjust that sale price or not? Some real estate agents might call all of that a concession, but I think that's just the misconception of what a concession may be. It's actually compensation. And if the realtor organization wants to call it a concession, then, and we as appraisers have to be very careful and understand that very well, right? Because is it truly a concession, or is it something that's been baked into that sale price forever, right? We've had this ongoing history of between 5 and 6% typically. And I've seen that go all over depending upon the amount of the sale price and so forth. But that's a typical amount. And then it's split in between those two different agents. And it was always negotiable. It's just that now it's probably even a little more negotiable, because you have to have that conversation before you even start looking at particular houses and putting offers.
I know the settlement's really new, and we really haven't seen a lot of market transactions transpiring over the past couple months to, really make a good analysis and determination of how this is affecting real estate. But in what you've seen recently, how has it affected sale prices of properties? And I asked that of Darwin first, and then Heather, to you on the commercial side.
Well, unfortunately, I don't go out there and do a lot of appraisals these days. I'm doing bank reviews, But what I can tell you, the people that I have talked to in the field, is that it just makes that verification process more intense. Well, let's just take a hypothetical and let's make it $1 million sale, just to be a round number. So if we have $1 million sale and there is 2.5% commission or compensation being offered from the seller's broker to the buyer's broker for that particular deal, the sale price is going to be the same as it was in the past, right? Or potentially the same if that was how it was done in that particular market area in the past. However, if that listing broker has zero compensation, the seller says, hey, look, there's no way I'm going to offer the buyers anything here. We're just going to say it's a zero compensation. Well, now the agreement that they have with the potential buyer broker is nothing. That buyer broker now has to figure out how they're going to get their commission and if the buyer is going to pay that commission or not. I think there's a potential there for steering away from those type of homes by certain agents, which is something we're trying to avoid. But it could be that happens where if they don't offer any compensation, the buyer's a representative, broker, agent, whoever it might be, might say, hey, look, that's probably not the property that you want to get into because they're not offering any compensation. Let's look at some other stuff. But it might reduce the amount of the sale price by that compensation amount as well. So that's where it's going to affect potentially the sale prices. The problem is how is the appraiser going to know what that amount was? And the only thing that I can tell you is that I think that it's part of the part 1.4, right, of USPAP, where it says collect, verify, and analyze all information in order to produce a credible result. That's where I think we're headed. We're just going to have to do our job better as appraisers.
So we're going to have a conditions of sale adjustment.
I don't know if it's going to be called a condition of sale. I certainly wouldn't call it that. And it's not a concession, but it may be something that we have to address in the actual analysis and reconciliation of our sale price with our conclusion of value and the sales comparison approach.
Darwin, would I be correct in saying that in most markets we're using the 5 to 6% is typical? If it turns out that a particular transaction like the one you described is not typical, let's say that seller did pay the 2% and then nothing else was done, that's where potentially some adjustments can be made or on the appraisal. Is that if it's atypical either way, where there wasn't the normal amount, I say normal in quotes, amount of compensation, that's when the potential for an adjustment would be made. But if it is still typical, regardless of how it all works out, not much further needs to be done. Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's correct. When we look at the GSEs, they allow a 2 to 9%, adjustment for concessions in those sales. And they don't call it a concession if it's a typical scenario within that marketplace and traditional way of doing things. And I would say that is a pretty sound thing that's been happening throughout our market, right? It's been between that 5 and 6% in most of the markets that I know of. And it does change with different properties. You get a really high end property and that percentage might go down. Or if you get bare land, it might go up, where they want a little bit more compensation for trying to make that sale work. Again, I think it's all about the verification process. Who paid who what? If it's traditionally a situation where that commission for both sides or the compensation for both the buyer's agent or the buyer's broker and the selling broker are in the sale price, there's no adjustment. But if it's something different than that, then we're going to have to make the decision on whether that's something that has to be adjusted for or not.
And Heather, you were talking about the commercial brokerage agreements that the commissions, the consideration for the commissions are not included on the listings. Have you seen this settlement affect current listings or newer listings of commercial real estate?
Not really, because this is a practice that we as commercial brokers were used to already. When I have somebody looking at a property, it is market specific. So I go to, the CCIM national NAR conferences and I'm talking to other commercial brokers, and some of them have a really strong commercial MLS, or they have a section of their MLS that's really strong commercial. Here where I am locally, we don't. So we rely on other sources of, whether that's Crexi, CoStar, Brevitas, whatever it is, we're relying on other sources for these advertisements that generally don't have a compensation in it. And now, of course, the MLS doesn't anyway. When I'm showing a property, a commercial property, I'm picking up the phone. The first question I'm asking, is it still available or is it under contract? Second question before I show is usually, are you offering compensation to a buyer's agent? And I've been doing this since I've been doing it, way before the settlement. And most of the commercial brokers that I talk to, that's exactly what they're doing, even if it's for lease. So we were already having this conversation pretty much all the time, because a lot of our listings, a lot of the properties we're selling, or even if it's off market, we were already having to have this conversation. And it's not always 50-50. It's not always 50-50 split between the buyer's agent, the listing agent. I've seen it 70-20. I've seen it 100-0 where there's nothing offered. So the other thing I will say is we have a lot of off-market transactions that happen in commercial, and a lot of the buyers and sellers will do it just straight through an attorney. So I rely on more on an attorney than I see a lot of residential transactions relying on. Usually with the residential, the attorney's coming in towards the end, towards closing. Typically, I know there's some exceptions. I'm talking to the attorney almost from day one. And some brokerages, the attorney's even writing the sales contract. I think some of that traditional compensation, those off-market transactions, they're really turning that somewhat into their attorney's fees as well in what they're paying, whether it's on the buyer's or the seller side. And, as far as exclusive right to represent for a buyer, we try to get them. I've talked to other brokers who've said this too. It's not as easy to get in the commercial world. We just, for whatever reasons, I've heard a multitude that buyers in the commercial world, they don't tend to want to sell the want to sign the exclusive agencies as much. So that's always been a challenge. So we're just I haven't seen, to go back to your original question, I haven't seen a whole lot change. I'm not saying that it won't in the future, but again, we already had some of these issues in the commercial world that we were dealing with already.
Tonia, I'm curious. Heather mentions attorneys in real estate transactions. That's from my vast real estate research from watching $1 Million Listing New York. That's the way it goes in your market too, right?
Yeah, in the commercial market, usually there's a broker who lists the property, and we generally don't have a lot of co-brokerage deals on the commercial side. The broker who lists it gets the buyers or the tenants for that real estate. There are some instances where there are co-brokerage deals, and those have to be negotiated between the brokers on how they're going to split the commission. But a lot of times in our market, they don't like to split commissions, similar to what Darwin had said. I know on the residential side, if you're a seller and you're able to find a buyer who does not have a broker, chances are you'll convince your seller to sell the property a little cheaper so that you can get the full benefit of the brokerage commission instead of having to split it. I've seen that happen a lot in the market I'm in, and it sometimes concerns me. But now hearing what Darwin and Heather have said, talking about how they're trying to be equitable and fair, I understand it. I see the concern and why the settlement came into play. It's also something to think about because commercial and residential, both of them, brokerage markets are huge. There are many more brokers out in the world than there are appraisers. And it's concerning that something this large has gone on for so long, that on the commercial side, they were able to negotiate. But on the residential side, it was creating such an impact on the ability to purchase real estate. It affected prices. I'm sure it still will going forward, but it makes us think, why was the sale price more or less? Is there any other issues with the real estate, or is there any other issues on the agreement, how the agreement came about? So, Warren, that actually brings me to a next question. How will this affect our appraisals going forward?
Well, from my point of view, Tonia and Darwin, you can chime in whenever. Verification of the data is going to be super important. So, it used to be where I could go to my MLS and I could see that who paid what and how that broke down. And as we mentioned earlier, as long as that was typical, not much further needed to happen. But now I'm starting to see some larger numbers in some of the fields that I'm thinking, I wonder what that has to do with. So calling and verifying what exactly happened is super important. And I wouldn't say that agents are any better than they used to be about getting back to us, but I have talked to many of my appraiser colleagues who have kind of drafted and constructed emails that are kind of boilerplate emails of making it real easy, like fill in the blank. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Agent, you had this transaction at 123 Main Street. I am doing the appraisal. I need to know what this, you mentioned this $25,000. How did that break down? And usually I'll start with an email, then maybe a text, then maybe a phone call. But it's ultimately super important now to verify that information.
And Darwin, what do you think?
I think you're dead on, right? Like we've been supposedly doing this for a long time. The problem is the word verification is not defined in our dictionaries and other places. And some appraisers think that the verification process means that if you find the same data in two different places, you've verified that it's the same. And unfortunately, I think that falls a little bit short of what our duties are under USPAP when it says collect data, then verify data, and then analyze that data, right? So I think that when it comes to how we look at this particular scenario, we don't know whether that commission or that compensation has been shared equally amongst the buyer's broker and the selling broker. So we need to ask that question as appraisers on each comparable that we're working with. And I know I did this in the past in my market area when I wasn't getting answers back from real estate agents. I started telling people I couldn't use it as a comp because I couldn't verify that the data was accurate. And so they get left out of different appraisal assignments. And then when it comes to the next appraisal assignment, they want to know, well, why didn't you use these particular comps? And I said, well, I couldn't verify the data. If you can't verify the data, I don't know how you're going to use it. You don't know. You have to make an assumption at that point. So I know that's on the extreme side, but it seems like we're going to be the ones that are tasked with making sure that we do the verification process and that we know how much compensation was paid by whom and how did that potentially impact the sale of that particular property. Now, concessions are a different thing. When we start looking at concessions and sellers paying the buyers, closing costs or some of that other stuff, that falls into that interested party contributions that Fannie and Freddie allow up to 2 to 9% of that. And this is outside of that. So even though if it's represented in your MLS as a concession, know that it's not a concession. It's just the compensation for the real estate brokers, which falls outside of those interested party concessions or contributions.
Now, Darwin, when you do your verification process, do you find that brokers or other market participants are willing to give you this information, or is it still difficult to obtain?
It's still difficult to obtain. And I've had where one side says that this is actually what happened and the other side says this is what happened. So you really do need to see and hear both sides of the story if you have any questions at all. It's nice to verify that sale price and the transaction, the motivations of the buyers and the sellers to know that if it's market value transaction or not.
I was in a seminar this last weekend where it had some agents and appraisers, and one appraiser gave an anecdote that he made this verification call and the agent was offended, saying, how dare you ask how much money I made? Do I ask you how much money you make? And it wasn't me, but I would have said, well, there is an engagement letter that did say how much money I made, but I just thought that was a very odd angle from the agent to be offended that somebody was asking how much money they made because it's not much different than it used to be.
Do you think there's going to be some time in the future when they're going to require commission agreements to be part of the recorded deeds?
Boy, I don't think it's going to go that far. I think it's going to be a situation where if there's an amount of compensation that's typical within that market between the buyers and the brokers of the residential properties that we're talking about, 1 to 4 family, if that's a typical transaction, I don't think anything's going to change as far as how the appraiser goes about his or her business. We have to be careful about that, right? Because it's not a concession. It's just the amount of compensation that's being paid to both sides. Now, if there's no compensation, again, if the buyer's having to pay for it and that's atypical, that might be an adjustment that an appraiser has to make. Maybe it's already reflected in the sale price though.
Okay, Darwin or Heather, Darwin, either one, case study time, okay? Kind of getting toward the end of class, we always open up to the back of the book. We've got a case study to work through. Get in groups. Here's what we're doing. Okay, so Darwin, your earlier example, 1234 Main Street, Anywhere, Montana, $1 million sale price. Listing agent has offered 2% to the buyer's side. Now, the buyer's agent has a Bentley payment, Pilates membership, smoothie of the day fees, and 20 grand just isn't going to cut it. They're used to making 28 grand on that at 2.8%. They want that extra 0.8%. They agree with the buyer that I will get that through asking for a seller concession. So I guess my first question is this allowed? Or if it is, how should we see this shown in the MLS? So we got $1 million sales price, 2% offered, but the buyer needs 2.8. He's going to get the other 0.8. So the buyer asks for a seller concession of $8,000. Is that legal? Is that okay?
I think you're going to have to talk to the GSEs about that, right? But it doesn't seem like that would be an appropriate place. It's not part of the compensation. It's actually a concession. And you have to dive into what the GSEs call a concession. I can read some of that to you if you're interested.
I kind of thought this ahead of time that is going to show in my MLS as a seller concession of $8,000, which would be totally typical on $1 million transaction. But if I were to call and find out that $8,000 was actually to pay that buyer's agent the extra $8,000 because they were going to be short on the Ferrari payment, then now we have an issue.
Thought it was a Bentley.
Well, they have both, and that's why the money has to be there.
You can see how it'll easily be one of those things that we're going to have to try to figure out over time. Let me read to you Fannie Mae's selling notice. It's just one paragraph that I want to read. It's a selling guide B3-4.1-02, interested party contributions. And those IPCs permits interested parties, including property sellers, to make contributions to the borrower's closing costs, subject to maximum limits ranging between 2 to 9% of the property value. Typical fees and/or closing costs paid by seller in accordance with local custom, known as common and customary fees or costs, are not subject to the IPC limit described in selling guide. If a seller or seller's real estate agent continues to pay the buyer's real estate agent commission in accordance with local, common, and customary practices, these amounts are not required to be counted towards IPC limits for the transaction. They're typical in the marketplace. As part of our standard risk management practices, we continuously review and evaluate our selling guide policies. We will continue to monitor the various real estate commission lawsuits and settlements and evaluate the potential implications to the mortgage industry and our policies. They're saying the same thing. Look, if it's a typical transaction in your marketplace and that compensation has been given to the buyer's broker and the selling broker, then it's typical and shouldn't be adjusted for. And they allow for up to 2 to 9% of these property, interested party contributions for typical closing costs. So when it comes down to the Bentley payment, I don't think it's typical. So I think it's an adjustment that may have to be made by the appraiser. But is it a total of 2.8%? Is it typical in the marketplace? Maybe.
So now we understand we have to do a little extra digging on the appraisal side. How do you think this affects the overall real estate industry, in particular the brokerage side? Do you think it's good or bad for the industry, this new settlement?
I'm still trying to figure where that city is that I can be a broker and have a Bentley and a Ferrari both. As a broker, let me know where that is. I don't know. I think it has yet to be determined. I hear a lot of people saying it's still business as usual, and that, what we're seeing, and again, it's so new. I mean, we're in September, and I think the hard deadline, if I remember right, was August for not having it in the MLS. And I've seen some houses, and I don't work in the residential, but just from what, personally buying and selling, where the overall has ticked down a little bit, maybe from 6 to 5 in some cases. But for so far, I mean, it seems to still be a lot of sellers they understand the value of splitting the commission, and that it's, if they don't offer it, that they may hurt the traffic that's coming through. So, I mean, I don't know if that exactly answers your question, and as far as on the commercial side, like I said, it's business, it's business per usual for the most part. And I don't want to be quoted that it's in everything, but even before this settlement, I would show properties, and I've had buyers say, do I pay you, or are you getting paid by the seller? If I need to pay you, then, what do we need to sign? So it's not as uncommon in the commercial world for the buyer to pay the compensation. So, and I've had those discussions before.
And Darwin, how about you? Do you think this is a good thing for the industry, or do you think it's just make it more difficult to do work as a broker?
I think it's a little more work as a broker, but I also don't mind doing it because now I've made sure that all my competition has to do the same thing that I've done all along, is have an arrangement with my buyer, make sure I have that representation, and then go to the MLS and look for the, compensation amount that's being offered for that property. I don't care whether it's 1% or 5% when I'm trying to deal with my clients, because I'm trying to make sure that they get the property they want, not how much money I make. The other thing to note here is that what we're really trying to talk about is whether the buyer pays that buyer broker directly or whether they pay through the sale price. They're still paying for it.
Well, we want to thank our listeners once again for coming today. And you can always subscribe on YouTube and Spotify to catch all the episodes.
Thank you guys for joining us. See you on our next episode of Face Value.